CEO of CGLA Infrastructure, joining us here this morning to help us walk through it. Norman, what comes next here as we find out how Washington reacts to this? When will we get an answer on what the final version looks like?
That'll take a while. It's really interesting because on the one hand, you've got the infrastructure bill, which took about a year to put together. Now they've got 3 weeks to sell it to the Congress. But in the middle of all that, the president started to talk about gasoline tax. And the gasoline tax sort of genie is now out of the bottle. You have the Chamber of Commerce talking about it. You have Ray LaHood talking about it. You have everybody talking about the gasoline tax, the idea that we're going to find money in a period of incredible budget deficit. So it's not a done deal by any means right now.
So how does this throw a wrench into it, Norman? Because it seems that, as you pointed out, February 14th, that bipartisan meeting, Trump seemed to show some degree of support for 25-cent hike to the gas tax. And since then, the pushback has been pretty swift. A group that has partial funding from the Koch brothers and a large of the Republican supporters have then put out reports saying, hey, it's going to hurt the folks that voted for you the most. I mean, is this going to make things complicated?
Multimedia marketplace.
Well, yeah, I mean, this makes things really complicated, and it's fascinating, right? Because, you know, on the one hand, you've got, again, they spent a year crafting a bill that really focused on cities and states, driving private investment, convincing cities and states and the federal agencies to shed assets so that you could bring in private sector investment, new private sector investment. They launched the proposal, and then 2 days later, the president says, well, maybe we should, you know, come up with another scheme for federal money. And I think I think that, you know, in terms of your question, you know, you've got a lot of confusion. I don't think Paul Ryan necessarily wants to raise taxes during an election year, especially when you've got you're cruising towards $1 trillion budget deficit this year, next year, and the following year. So you've got those issues, which are, I think, pretty big issues. On the other hand, you know, if you were going to take seriously the let's say the infrastructure plight of our country, you got to get all the tools in play, a gasoline tax plus increased private investment. You got to do both of those things. You might have to think about a national infrastructure bank as well, because you're really talking about a very different infrastructure model. One, at least the White House original plan was talking about a very different infrastructure model, one where the cities, the states, figured out how to structure projects to attract private investment in infrastructure projects.
So, Norman, we're looking at some of the details surrounding the plan, as well as the gas tax, the effect. If this doesn't happen, then is the conversation that we've been having really the past week, and perhaps some of it is because the market got shaken up and people were looking for answers. They started blaming the deficit. They started blaming spending. But there's also a great deal of logic behind that, which is, look, this is going to be adding stimulus on top of an economy that by most measurements is pretty solid here. What is the payout from that infrastructure? Help people understand from what you see where that stimulus will have the positive effects, even if it does cost us some.
No, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I think the way I think about it is that the U.S. economy has a real productivity problem. That's really where infrastructure comes in. You take away, it's almost a shock absorber for the economy. If we could figure out how to invest in infrastructure, we do about 1.3% of GDP in infrastructure right now, which is by far the lowest of any industrialized country. And the other issue that's a big problem is look at all the incredible innovation coming out of Silicon Valley, plus new ideas for new types of infrastructure. So you've got all sorts of new ways. If you look at Autodesk and BIM technology, that's transformative in terms of what we can do with infrastructure. But then look at Hyperloop or look at driverless vehicles. All of a sudden, we need to because these are investments that you make now that last for 20, 30, or 40 years. And the investments you make now, they produce 7x in terms of jobs and spend over the next 30 or 40 years in terms of the initial capital costs. So an infrastructure investment now makes a lot of sense for the productivity of the economy, sort of unleashing that issue that's holding us back.
Norman, when we think about this from the investor's perspective and the market's perspective, for many, the expectations for infrastructure presented another opportunity to kind of ride the wave of White House policy in the market. We've seen some pretty sizable gains since the plan was announced, just looking at groups like the industrial sector, talking about materials as well, getting a bump, and some of the transports as well. But given that this is the 1.5 trillion is expected to come from a reaction by a public-private sort of combination from that initial 200 billion directly spent by the federal government, how does that change who benefits? Will it be these publicly traded and large companies that we're used to seeing, or is it going to be something different?
Well, one of the things that I think is that we've got to figure out how to, in terms of the engineering construction companies, the AECOMs of the world, Fluors, et cetera, those guys live on pretty thin margins. Margins of their competitors around the world, the Spanish companies tend to be 10 to 12%. Other companies, I was talking to the CEO of a Turkish company the other day, his margins as an engineering construction company are 20%. What that allows you to do is take risks. It allows you to innovate. It allows you to integrate new technology. So when we talk about the traditional infrastructure industry, I actually think that model is going away, and there's a real opportunity. If you were going to really double investment in infrastructure, and that, by the way, is what the $1.5 trillion budget does, because it's $150 billion a year over 10 years. But what that does is it does two things. I think it brings a lot of new players into the infrastructure space, but it also ramps up our ability to integrate technology into infrastructure. So if you talk, you've got some real issues on the procurement side. If you talk to a head of an authority, CEO of, for instance, one of the largest transit authorities in the U.S., it takes him 3 years, start to finish, to get a bid out on new ticketing machines. That means he's using, old technology into the future, into the next 10 or 15 years. Big problem with living in such a fast-paced technology world, but having public sector bureaucrats making decisions over what you're able to do.
So trying to expedite. We're going to leave it there. Norman, great conversation. I want to chat more with you because you mentioned some companies there, and we love companies. So next time we're going to dive a little deeper. Norman Anderson, excellent analysis, President and CEO of CGLA Infrastructure.